And thank you for joining us here on PM Express. I'm pretty sure you have heard in the last few days the emergence of the word debt restructuring in our economic parlance. Why? Because we are approaching the IMF, and the IMF will not lend to a country unless that country can prove that it has sustainable debt levels. And that is why this has become a very important word in the last few days. It is so critical to our survival as a people that I've chosen tonight to break this down for the benefit of all of us with the help of the IMF itself, because my friends at the IMF will give me some bits that I can share with you to help you appreciate what this will mean for you and for this economy going forward. Then at the end of it all, when I'm done with this breakdown on my smart wall, I'll bring in others who know this terrain. But I particularly is interested in how this may affect households, the banking sector, the financial system generally, going forward into what may be the eventual result of our conversation with the IMF. And we know that over the weekend, the finance ministry all but confirmed that you can't expect restructuring. What form that will take, the parameters of that and the broad scope of which we don't know yet. But if you listen to Samson Aklego, who is a director of finance at the Ministry of Finance, he gives you a sense that this is something that is on the table firmly. And there's issued a statement today. I'm talking about the finance ministry, which in essence tells us that they are going to be doing this. The focus is that they want debt sustainability. So they're doing a debt sustainability analysis. A report will be submitted to the IMF. The IMF will have its own input. How this pans out, the nature of it, we don't know. But government's main concern here, whatever they do when it comes to the restructuring of the debt, their key point is they want to minimize the impact on the banking system. They don't want to destroy people's confidence in the banking sector as a whole. And that is a critical point to note. And I'll return to this as I break this down. But I start tonight with a short video my friends at the IMF pointed me to that I wanted to share with you. It gives you the basic meaning, what restructuring is, what it could mean for you, the processes that government is going to be undertaking, the IMF, the finance ministry, and our representatives in this conversation with the IMF. That has begun today. Throughout the week, this is going to happen. I want you to watch this from the IMF. The IMF's own internal team put this together to help us understand what the restructuring will look like when you do it, when you decide not to do it, its possible impact, and why it is such a sensitive matter that requires broader consultation, transparency, and trust. Watch this, after which I'll come back and break it down even further. So that's exactly what the IMF is attempting to do. They want to give us a place to start. They want to give government a place to start this interaction with our creditors, our lenders, those who've given government money. The key thing to know, which you didn't hear in that, is that a government has two options. They want to restructure the external debt, and they want to do domestic debt. Let's tonight focus on the domestic debt restructuring, because that is what sources say is likely on the table. Why? Because if we attempt to do a restructure our external debt, and that's a whole conversation we'll come to later as this process goes on, we will be locked out, certainly, out of the Eurobond market. We can't go outside and borrow anymore. We're already locked out already. Remember that restructuring technically is default. You're saying, I can't pay you, and so you have to possibly take a haircut. It's a very painful process. And that is why the suggestion is government is focusing on domestic debt. The bonds you bought, the treasury bill, etc., is what government may be looking at as a way of negotiating, sitting down with you and negotiating and say, how much of that can you forgo so this country can survive? So that's possibly what is going to happen. That's why we'll focus on that. Now, I'm going to do a series on this going forward because this is a long process. So we'll start with that. The thing to note, and this is again is according to my IMF friends, that debt restructuring, domestic debt restructuring is a very painful thing. It's like surgery, as I said. You only do it if you must. You have to do a calculation and determine will the benefits outweigh the costs. If you come to a conclusion that the cost is going to outweigh the benefits, you don't do it. And in this case, for Ghana, because banks it's been estimated up to 70% of the banks that we have in Ghana currently are heavily exposed. 70% of their exposure is to government bonds, government securities, government treasury bills, etc. It's one of those things that could spell doom for our economy. So you need to think about this pretty carefully, which is that you have to factor in if the benefit of having your debt sustainable will, not match up to the cost of attaining it, then you don't touch it. And that's why government is doing tonight. I've done over the weekend, understand government, took a lot of the officers to, I think, Koforidua, and they went to think through this very, very carefully. And you're just hoping, trusting, that our people at the finance ministry and the government will get this right. Because if you get it wrong, you can only get it right at the first time, right? And so that is key. Have they done that balancing act, and what is it? Now, the thing to note about this, again, according to the IMF, if you look generally at emerging markets, the reason why in the past there wasn't enough research around domestic bond restructuring, domestic debt restructuring. Why? Because a lot of the focus in the past had been restructuring of external debt. But in the last few years, in fact, the last decade, the IMF has done a broader assessment of things for the emerging markets and come to the conclusion that the domestic debt levels have increased up onto 46% of countries' debt stock. And that alone means you cannot take domestic debt off the table if you want to restructure. And so that is a very important thing. And we'll show you our debt portfolio, how much is domestic, how much is foreign. And then you begin to see why, rightly so, Bloomberg and co. were saying that domestic debt is what we're going to be looking at. I'll tell you, because that tells you that our domestic debt is very, very significant. I mean, and I am yet to know anybody who has some money, hasn't put it in some treasury bill or some bond of a sort. So that gives you a sense. And countries depend on it when they face fiscal economic stress. It's where countries go. Thankfully tonight, we will also show you the case of Zambia because it's very close to us. There's a lot of lessons we can learn from there, by the way. And look at this graph for me for a second. And this is emerging markets generally. The IMF helped us with this, the share of domestic debt of developing economies. And look at how it's grown over the years. From 2000 to now, over the last 2 decades, is almost showing a sign of an upward trajectory there. And so that tells you a story of why it's so key now that countries are increasingly being encouraged by the IMF to do domestic debt restructuring and not necessarily jump onto the external debt restructuring. That's what we'll be facing. Again, if you look at what we have here, debt restructuring, again, may be the easier option for governments to take because it's easier than, the external debt. Why? Because authorities can simply elect to change the terms of the contract, changing the domestic law. Government could go to parliament and change the law surrounding, for example, interest rates. Interest rates are going to the roof. They can use the legislation to reduce it. That instantly will reduce how much government is paying to service the domestic debt. You cannot do that necessarily if it's external debt because it's governed by international law. You can't change international law, but you can change domestic law. So that's one of the key areas. And this is according to the IMF. It's why it's easier to do. And maybe it's the reason why government is thinking about doing that instead of going to the external market to do it. Again, if you look at it, domestic debt is often held predominantly by domestic creditors, and which means the domestic creditors will suffer. You, myself, banks, institutions, pension funds, etc. They put their money in it. And especially in a country like ours, where banks, pension funds, instead of investing in, say, businesses and agriculture, its government bonds are safe. They say it's a lazy man's approach, but the banks love that. They put a lot of your money there, right? And so a lot of your money in treasury bill, etc., is held with banks. Heavy exposure. And that is why when Dr. Tuahini joins us, he will join us pretty short, he's a bank consultant, he will tell you that you need to watch that carefully because of the exposure that we have. Now, sovereign debt distress can easily spread to domestic banks. And that is, for me, one of the key things I want us to pay attention to here because of the impact, this might have on the banking sector. So banks may struggle. So you begin to see domestic banks may be affected by what may happen, pension funds, households, that is yourself, if you have money in there, and other parts of the domestic economy. All of that may take a hit. I mean, depending on what government decides to do eventually, or it may be minimal, or it may be severe. Nobody knows yet. But it may actually make the current economic crisis even worse if you don't get it right. And that is why government must approach this very carefully. The key is to do your cost-benefit analysis, right? If you do that, and that's why, in fact, when I've been speaking to my IMF sources, months back, the IMF guys were very sure that domestic debt restructuring will be too dangerous because of the exposure of the financial sector to it, right? Everybody was so certain until very recently that some may have significantly changed here. And because the cost-benefit analysis is obvious. If you touch the external ones, it's not as bad, right? And then, if you have to do this, the IMF again tells us, and this is an IMF document that you can find and read if you research around this on the IMF's own website and speaking to people there. They'll say sometimes you want to restructure domestic bonds and domestic debts, it's not only bond debt broadly. Government might have to consider, do you want to recapitalize the banks or you want to replenish pension savings because they may take a hit? So it's a very complex, sensitive matter. This is no joke. Don't let anybody tell you it's a joke. And government must handle this sensitively. Similarly, ensuring that continued effective functioning of the central bank is also very important. So everybody's going to be at the table. And that is why there's a call for government to extend this and be more transparent in the process, because that brings in trust. Now, this graph here is one of the most important graphs I want you to appreciate. This is our external versus domestic debt portfolio. If you go back to, this is 2021, which I've circled here, you would see that your external debt is in the light blue, the domestic debt is in the deep blue. The external debt, as of 2021 September, was less than the domestic debt, which means that a year ago, we had more domestic debt than we had external debt. You begin to appreciate why there's a focus. So if you want to cut somewhere, if you want relief somewhere, you're going to possibly focus on where your biggest exposure is. And last year, by this time, we had domestic debt at 178 billion, as against external debt at 167.7 billion cedis. However, if you come to this year, this is June 2022, the Ministry of Finance own source, that has changed a bit, right? The focus now that we have more external debt at 303 billion as against 190 billion domestic debt. But the difference, I must submit, isn't that great, because we're just talking about some 13 billion, right? And so if you touch external debt, that's it. You can't go there for a while, for a long, long time. And government wants IMF to bring policy credibility. Why? Because if you get that credibility, you may become possibly creditworthy again in the eyes of the external market, and maybe you can go again. But if you tell them you can't pay, so please take a haircut, then that is pricing yourself completely out of the market. Maybe. That's why government is focusing on domestic debt. We don't know. But that is the portfolio where we are now. So it's very close. So if government is focusing on domestic debt, some say, well, this number says it is realistic to do so. So that's one of the things. Now, I want to bring you the Zambia example. And Zambia is so interesting because it took them almost 2 years to get an IMF program. In fact, it's only on the 31st of August, last month, that the IMF Executive Board approved their program. Zambia, in 2000, in the midst of COVID, they started defaulting on their debt. Pay attention to that. That is a very fascinating story when you begin to read it, because then they couldn't pay their debt. And so they went to the IMF. IMF said, you can't pay, you are struggling, but I can't help you because your debt is not sustainable. So come to me with a plan that will make your debt sustainable, then I can help you, which is what will happen to us, by the way, because our debt is unsustainable. So we need to show to the IMF that we have a plan, and that is why debt restructuring is important. Zambia wanted 1.3 billion from the IMF when they got there, right? The difference with us is We are not there yet when it comes to default. We are not defaulting yet. We are still honoring our obligations. But Gambia defaulted 2021. They went to the IMF. IMF says, we can't help you unless you come to us with a plan. So what did Zambia do? And this is a framework that, if you read the literature, and this, by the way, is literature that you can find if you research, that shows that the Zambia is offering a template now for many of the emerging markets who has been predicted, and Ghana will not be the last to go in terms of these negotiations, may also have to follow this template. So what happened? Let's go through it. So they have what they call an official creditor committee for Zambia that was formed. And this is very important, co-chaired by China and France. And this official creditor committee, why China? Because when you look at the debt portfolio for Zambia, the Chinese state banks and financial institutions were heavily exposed. So they had to represent the Chinese creditors. And so China became part of this official creditor committee. And then France, obviously, the Eurobonds. Europeans were heavily exposed. So France, they co-chaired it. And they represented the creditors, right? And then the creditors then had to sit with the Zambian government to strike a deal. Remember what I said earlier. IMF said, we won't give you the money. We won't give you any program unless you can strike an agreement or get a pledge from your creditors that they will sit with you to agree to restructure. So Zambia then had to sit down and negotiate. Right? So if you look, Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia, we understand are all following the same blueprint. But another thing that I find in the Zambia thing that is important is that the G20 had come in with some form of a structure, which is very interesting. In 2021, the GMS came together and they formed a committee, a framework, right? A framework for all the other countries that may go this way, may suffer this challenge we are going through, to go under. It is under that framework that Zambia had this official creditor committee. So it may be possible that in Ghana's case, we will form an official creditor committee with, because remember, the important thing to note here is that what government is attempting to do is not automatic. They need to negotiate with you if you're a creditor, if you're holding government bond. They need to get your buy-in and you need to agree before they can go. Other than that, you can sue government. If they want to restructure external debt or domestic debt, they'll need the creditors. They'll need those holding government bonds to say, we'll agree, and the government would go ahead. It's only at that time that the IMF will come in and help. Now, the thing about this, the Zambia only reached a staff level agreement with the IMF for a 1.4 billion, in December, staff agreement. But they will not get the executive board approval. Why? Because the creditors, the creditor committee, didn't agree that they would, restructure their debts, right? Why? Because the IMF, and this is very interesting, the IMF said, in Zambia, do not restructure your domestic debt. Only do your external debt. The external, creditors said, but why? They started criticizing the IMF. The interesting thing in that is that in Ghana, the conversation is around domestic debt. And I've showed you why, because of the portfolio and all the other factors. So why is it that government is not focusing on that? Well, it may be a mix of both. Some have suggested. We'll get into that. It may be a mix of both. We don't know exactly how this will pan out, but the conversation has been the domestic debt. It may be a mix of both. Because in Zambia, IMF agreed with Zambia that only touch your external debt. I'll tell you why shortly. And the whole project was to reduce Zambia's debt. So this is the IMF statement on 31st of August, giving Zambia the go-ahead now and approving the facility. This was only possible after the creditor committee, the external creditor committee chaired by China and France, issued a statement in September of this year pledging to agree to sit with Zambia and negotiate a restructuring of the debt. That lesson is, unless the creditors, domestic bondholders, the treasury bill holders, they come together and negotiate and they agree, and they strike an agreement with the government, the IMF will not listen to us. So this is a very complicated process. It is until Zambia got the creditor committee to pledge that, yes, we know you can't pay us. Instead of losing everything because, you can't pay, you've been defaulting since 2020, we agreed to take a haircut. We agreed to lose part of our money we've given to you. It is only then that the IMF agreed to give Zambia the program for 1.4 billion. That is where Ghana is right now. We need to strike a deal and present it to the IMF. And the video you watched earlier, IMF was clear that they will make sure that in this whole conversation, the creditor, as in you who are given government money in terms of bonds and treasury, you don't suffer unduly. It has to be fair to all sides. But where government is right now is a point of saying, listen, I know I owe you, I can't pay you, and so please, you need to sit with me so I can restructure, change the terms of the agreement that we have with you. Now, finally, before I bring my guests into the conversation, I want to compare Zambia and Ghana in terms of the debt that they both hold, just to give you where Zambia is and where we are, right? So the total debt of Zambia, this is as of 2021. So I'm going to compare similar period. December 2021 was 31.7 billion. Ghana, 58.6 billion. So it's, night and day. The difference is very clear in terms of the debt portfolio that Zambia has. And then this second bit tells a story. External component is 17.3 billion. That's 54.57%. What is Ghana's? External component is 28.3 billion. That is 48%. Zambia was 54% external. External was the bigger chunk for Zambia. Domestic component was just 40%. That is 14 billion. In Ghana, it is 30 billion, 51%. So if you compare in the same period, December 21, 2021, you notice that Zambia focused rightly, and the IMF endorsed it, don't touch domestic because it's small. External is huge. And if you touch it, remember what I said, cost benefit. If your cost of restructuring domestic debt outweighs the benefit of getting your debt sustainable, IMF says don't do it, right? And so they probably would have considered this because in your debt sustainability analysis report will tell you that if you do this, your banks will collapse. Pensions might go, etc. So please don't touch it, right? Focus on external. And so they went external. In Ghana's case, the story is different. If you compare in the same period, 30 billion for domestic debt. So can you afford not to touch your domestic debt? Can Ghana afford, if you look at the numbers, not to touch your domestic debt and only focus on external debt? The answer, your answer is as good as mine. And that is why there is that focus on domestic debt, right? This is going to be a painful process for everybody involved. The government has to be transparent. And then you read the IMF thing, that sometimes when domestic bonds have been restructured, political influences will get in there and then shift the burden because politicians are exposed too. Because they have influence, they might shift the burden onto others. And so theirs wouldn't be touched. That shouldn't happen. The transparency must be there because Ghanaians' money are at stake here, right? And the IMF, thankfully, will be very transparent in the process. They will publish the debt sustainability analysis once it's done, and we'll get to see where we are. So that's the ABC of that restructuring. You see in the Zambia example, it tells you a lot. They went external debt restructuring. We are looking domestic because of the reality of where we are. My guests are joining me right now. I'm going to take a break. When I return, I'm going to be speaking to Seth Terkper. And the reason I want Seth Terkper to join us in this, because he's been here on this IMF conversation before. He, by himself, even away from the IMF program in 2014, 2015, started what they call the smart borrowing, right? It was a form of debt management that he led at the time. He set up a lot of vehicles to deliver that because we were in trouble then too. What did we do then? And what lessons possibly could we draw from this going into this negotiations with the IMF, right? And then we'll get the sense of what this means for the financial sector, the banking sector. Because really, that is where the real deal is. and we'll get a sense from Dr. Richmond Etiahene, who's a banking consultant who will join us. But you see both of them there on your screens. They are with me, tapping into their expertise after the break. Stay with me. Seth Terkper is former finance minister who himself led a government-wide reforms in terms of managing our debt, introduced several initiatives and innovations during his time when, of course, government had challenges with servicing its debt, introduced a lot of vehicles to try and manage the debt. I mean, I don't want to call it restructuring. I'll bring him in to tell me what he did then and what lessons we can learn in the process that we are about to begin with the IMF. Dr. Richmond Etiahene is a banking consultant and joins us right now via Zoom. I want to start with Dr. Etiahene. Doc, as the IMF explains to us, which I just illustrated, the fundamental challenge with domestic debt restructuring is its potential prohibitive impact on the financial sector, banks, pension funds, households who have bought bonds or treasury bills, etc. From where you sit, the way you analyze the Ghanaian banking sector, can the Ghana banking sector or the financial sector afford a restructuring such as is on the table in this conversation with the IMF?
Is a serious issue, very, very serious. Because why I say it's serious is that most of us have invested solely about 60% of the deposit in the government bonds and bills and what have you. At least some time ago, I made a comment that there will be, even if there was a crowding out, we should be very careful not to have this challenge that we are having at the moment. But other people didn't take what I was explaining. They thought maybe I was one of those who alarmist. But unfortunately, if you look at your Zambia exposure, if you go to Barbados, Grenada, if those things are applied, I don't think banks, some of the banks can survive. Because if you look at the way the haircut is done, or the hold out formula, the measuring of it, and if you hit your capital, if you use the IFRS 16, any losses that you have would hit your capital, and the capital, some of the bank's capital will go just like that. So we are in a very, very, very serious situation. It's a lesson that we Ghanaians should also learn. When instead of going to productive supporting the economy, we chose to use the lazy bank approach, as you said earlier. Now the consequences is very high. And I believe I have read literature, the literature you have read. I've read it several times, almost 1 month now. And when I look at it, I get frightened.
What frightens you?
What frightens me is that most of the banks are going to go under. Because you talk about, you said in some regulatory financial stability. In some other jurisdiction, they have funds to support the capital. Now you're going to follow on the shareholders to come and support something that has gone bad, which is not their fault, maybe a strategic dichotomy. Then the banks are going to be in serious trouble. And if you remember, Fitch downgraded 3 banks. I went into it, I studied it, and I look at their portfolio, and I say, yes, this is the reason why they were downgraded. And if you call your shareholders to come and inject capital for something like this, it will be very, very difficult. So the banking sector is going to face a huge challenge if we apply what I have seen from other jurisdictions. I've read the Zambia one, I've read the Grenada, Barbados, I've even read the Argentina in the 80s. In Argentina case, 75% haircut.
Wow.
So for every 100, you lose 75. How are we going to survive? So that's why I said, if you look at what is happening, we're in a that's why I like your argument, your discussion. There must be a serious transparency. I would have called so many people to discuss this issue because it's going to affect everybody in this country. The pension funds, you know, The major pension fund had so much of government bonds, bills and bonds. And if they were going to say, I don't know how they will continue to even pay the pensioners. So, Evans, we are in a serious, it's more serious than what we experienced in the 2017, 2018.
Yeah, in fact, you just mentioned that. I want to bring in Mr. Setekbe, who was the man in charge at that time. Mr. Setekbe, in your time, in 2013, 14, 15, when we were having the challenges the economy was facing, you by yourself, your government, which you led then as the finance minister, introduced some measures to control our debt. At the time, I mean, I don't know how you called it, debt management, was it restructuring, refinancing, whatever it is. Walk us through that a bit. But I am asking you to walk us through that because while you draw for us the lessons from there that either we can use now or possibly we have abandoned that has led us to where we are right now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me mention 3 quick things. First of all, in Ghana, we cannot trace our history of debt management or debt restructuring, however you call it, without mention of HIPC. Ghana was among the HIPC, countries, and we benefited. It's the reverse of what we are thinking about now. Our debt came down significantly, and then it ballooned again. And it was on the threshold of that ballooning around 60-65% that we started to introduce those measures. Remember, one of the things we did when I became minister was cabinet agreed that we should declare the end of HIPC and look to homegrown solutions because the HIPC flows were no longer coming in. Secondly, around the same time, I received an official letter that Ghana had become a middle-income country. Zambia is still a low-income country. So that's one distinction we might want to know when we are making these comparisons. Mm-hmm. And I know the fund, unlike the bank, the zones, it's catching up, with that. Because during the COVID, if you remember, Ghana was, with South Africa, were asking for debt forgiveness.
Yeah.
We were referred to go and get debt suspension. No less a person than the World Bank president, if you remember, mentioned Ghana should take advantage. You mentioned the G20. That was a mechanism available for middle-income countries. It was only fragile and some low-income countries that were getting debt forgiveness. Part of the G20 initiative you spoke about was under, by Zambia, was under, those that auspices. So the reality is that, yes, we had these downsides of less HIPC flows, and we also getting into, remember, single spine, doomsaw, and all those things. But we had been borrowing, this is where the initiative started. We had been borrowing to take off the single spine arrears, which is debt owed to workers in a way. We did and so we decided the first initiative was to put money aside from our oil revenue, which is in the constitution, to create a sinking fund. We do not have the time. I've spoken, I believe, on a show about the successes of sinking fund, but we took $550 million of our own money to take off, the first sovereign bond issued under His Excellency President Kufuor. As a nation, we did 336. That is the first sinking fund. And then, in fact, there was $250 million left in the sinking fund at the time, runabout. On October 4th, 2017, the current government used the $200 million to take off the final amount, 2017, October 4th, the 10th anniversary, to take off the balance. That is what sinking fund does for you. Many countries like Philippines and the rest, you cannot borrow. When President Biden wanted to do his big infrastructure initiative, they looked at debt. When President Trump wanted to do the wall, they look at the debt. What is this impact on the wall? No less a place like the United States is settled for lesser, right? Now, the second, major initiative we did was, in fact, to complement the sinking fund, or even ahead of the sinking fund, we also went to the World Bank, took a guarantee from the World Bank to support, because we're having difficulty, with, accessing the markets.
Yeah, the difficulties we are facing right now, again, was that, except that now it's more acute. Yours difficulty. As we speak right now, we are currently shut off from the market.
Yeah, but yes, we were not shut off. But remember the 10.2 we did was criticized at the time. But we were facing, the global financial crisis and other issues. I think we lacked the time to look at all the background. But with that 1 billion, the entire 1 billion went into refinancing of domestic debt. And remember I spoke about 550, the remaining 200 was used to exchange. That is the restructuring element.
So when you say refinancing, were you buying back the bonds? The
550 we bought back, yes. Ghana bought back and cancelled. We had, managers on the London and others, Ghana and other stock exchange, and they bought back, 336 million. The 200 million we paid, those who were holding the bonds. That's what the current government did.
Why did you choose? Why did you choose that option? Was it because you were afraid of this impact if you had attempted what is being proposed on the domestic economy?
No. One, our constitution says we may set up a sinking fund. I believe the drafters of the constitution know that we have had problems with rolling over. The problem with the TBL is that it's 90 days. It's supposed to be liquidity only to help government, especially at the beginning of the year when revenues are now coming in. But we keep rolling them out and they became long-term. So we needed funds to take them off, right? So we combined the guarantee and the sinking fund. It's in the constitution. It's the same with the contingency fund. It's in the constitution. So we exercised it, capped the stabilization fund, and this was the purpose for which we used, that money. So it's practical debt management. And if you look at the Public Financial Management Act, a debt management office, as a result of this, was supposed to be set up, similar to the Comptroller and Accountant General, to focus on the nation's debt. Did we have, and the point I want to make is that we did all these initiatives, mind you, 2013, 2014, and tabled them during the negotiations for the ECF.
Okay, so you went to the negotiations already with these to the IMF. And what did the IMF say to you when you presented them?
Well, the IMF looked at it critically. The World Bank was there. And mind you, World Bank Treasury was also helping us to do some of these restructuring and other things which I was talking about. The UK Treasury and others, but the World Bank and others were there. And we explained that we have debt. We can't put everything in consumption. Deficit is you've spent and you are going to borrow. And it's going to result in more debt, right? They were sympathetic. They would have wished that probably we focus more on the deficit and reduce it. But we explained and we said this was, policy. In fact, there was a point where when the crude oil prices fell, there was a suggestion that we should use a sinking fund to lower the deficit. We said we couldn't do it because you had to go to Parliament. It's part of the law, which we had said that we wanted to do. And remember, again, we were facing serious, remember crude oil prices were $99.
Yeah.
They fell to about $35. But we saw the first sovereign bond in particular waiting for us in 2017. Could we have reduced? Of course, we were comfortable at that time because we said we would do 5.9% deficit and we ended up with...
So bottom line, the IMF endorsed your debt management approach that you had been implementing before you met them and you took into and they endorsed it. I need to ask you this.
I don't know whether I want to use endorse because it's a negotiation, it's a discussion, and we convince them about the importance, including the stabilization fund, mind you.
So they bought into that. But let me ask you, Mr. Tekbe, we are beginning a very important, sensitive process with the IMF today, and debt sustainability is the topmost priority. The IMF issued their Q&A today, and it was number one. The government has issued a statement saying number one. Is there any lesson there? What should be the approach, if you may, very briefly? What is the best way, if there's anything like that, to approach this at this time with everything that we know and I've just explained?
Well, the fact that you have an IMF program, Yes, of course. Most of these initiatives are no longer working. But remember when they were working for us? We were in an IMF program. The IMF did not push us to do ESLA. We did it on our own initiative to tackle the banking sector, energy sector, and other crises. And we just informed them that we had imposed a levy because crude oil prices had fallen. We were losing revenue, but there was room to put a levy which was to last 2 to 5 years. And we did it before informing them in 2015, right? And it was working. We had restructured the VRA that the bankers will tell you, 2.2 billion Ghana cedis. We paid 500 million upfront. What I'm saying is that we should have a medium-term perspective that one day, and that was the motivation for the homegrown policy, we will be out of the IMF program. If we did everything well during the austerity period, which is a short term, but the medium term is waiting for us. Do you know when you have COVID? It was out of the experience of crude oil prices falling, out of the experience of the global financial crisis, doomsaw and all those, that we created a stabilization fund. You build it up when the times are good. 3 oil fields, could we have done more? Yes. So I would say in the context of your presentation, one, we are a middle income country. We would not get, those types of concessions, on the table. 2, yes, the focus now is debt. But we are talking about debt, and I know your topic is debt. But remember, debt is a product of revenue minus expenditure, which is higher, and you have a deficit, you borrow, and you must repay, and your amortization. We were borrowing, we were burying some of them, bailout costs and things in amortization. Remember the debate in 2019 and the rest, which is what the fund now wants transparency to adjust, right? So I think that, yes, the focus is debt, but what is giving rise to the debt, right? I mentioned the wall, I mentioned other things. If there are initiatives, which we cannot finance, like the e-school, the total number we wanted to do, I've started it several times, we should slash it because that is going to be part of the program. So we are looking at that. We are going through a painful discussion. The more painful discussion is when it comes to expenditure, because this is just debt, and we are discussing debt because the fund is saying that you must have return to a sustainable debt path through a DSA. And that's why we are discussing that now. But it doesn't mean that that is the whole picture.
Okay. And two quick points, Mr. Tekpe. There's a lot of focus, and I've explained possibly why, on domestic debt. Domestic versus external debt. Where should the balance be drawn in these conversations? What would you say, very briefly?
At this critical point, I'm following the fund debate. I'm following what you are reading about. For me, it's not in that middle income context where we are, and I've been making this point, African Development Bank everywhere. Africa's middle income countries. Africa is being stratified. Africa is not 55 countries to be given one prescription. Some countries, when we became middle income country, we couldn't get a blueprint, and that's how come.
So in our context right now,
the discussion now is debt, and we must focus on it. But I'm saying that eventually the discussion would have to be widened because you are not going to be. Zambia wants to be a middle income country, obviously, but for now they are not a middle income country. We are, and whether we are admonished or whatever, we are losing concessional financing. Evans, if you recall, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, was in Norway, said that we had become a middle income country, so they were cutting our grants, directing it more to social. That is the reality, part of the reality. And so we cannot put all our revenue, including oil revenue, which is new to the budget, into consumption.
In these conversations, if government is going to ever restructure, where should the focus be? Do you have a preference?
We should have both. I think we should have an open mind because our external debt, as we are saying, I think the fund focus is on the stock exchange where we cannot go now. Remember, like Zambia, we have Chinese debt. We also have EU debt. France is there because of the Paris Club. We are also exposed to the Paris Club. And they are the ones you can default easily. They are very strict in terms of technical default, right? Even a delay, can be a default, right? So I think we should, in the short term, yes, I do agree because, remember we have done most of what I'm talking about, which involve bankers being at the table, taking a cut in interest rates without even depositors knowing that, and that is because when what we did under ESLA was such that, yes, there was a haircut in interest rates, right? But then there was a cash flow that was assured.
Who took the haircut?
The banks.
Okay. In your time,
the
banks took a haircut, but shielded the customers from it.
Well, that is because in return, we injected 500 million US Ghana cedis immediately into the banks, right? And then we were assured, they were assured of 3 to 5 years. They were at the table. They did the math. They did everything, the projection, right? I'm not sure if Mr. Doc was in the team. I can't remember now. But they were there. And they were sure that within 3 to 5 years, ESLA will repay, the debt, which means that within 6 months or so, when of this being done, that debt was removed from the non-performing loan status, right? So there were benefits that were coming to it. So I'm saying that to the extent, and if you look at the Fitch report, Fitch is now talking about the possibility of debt of the sinking fund. It's going to be zero, being used, to talk to the external, depositors. So I'm saying, yes, the focus is there. We are being told what the difficulty is going to be. Let's keep an open mind because we can have dialogue, with that. I'm not saying that is.
And very
that is a critical point.
Very finally, if I bring in Dr. Richmond Chiahene into this. I mean, if the government team or I don't want to call it the government team, the Ghana team, if you're invited to join the Ghana team in this conversation, are you open to do this?
My former president called for a national dialogue. We did a national dialogue at Senchi. So I'm with my president on that point, that the problems require all Ghanaians at the table. We did it. That's what Senchi was all about. We did it with Labour and others. That's what and Takrady were all about. So it is not new, to me, and I benefited. Remember, out of that process, it was even said that because of homegrown, I was resisting going to the fund, right? Yeah, but my point was that we needed to table the homegrown policy.
Yeah, I remember that. I was saying to you, and not everybody applauded you for saying cheese. That's the point you're making. I remember that. I mean, but
that's where the consensus comes in.
Yes, I agree. But back to the point very briefly. I mean, if you're called to the table, now we are beginning, and say, Seth, join the Ghana team. You're available and you don't mind joining.
I said President Mahama has made that call already. And I believe that he made it in good faith to all Ghanaians to join.
I'm grateful, Uncle Seth, as a Tekba is a former finance minister. Dr. Richmond Chiahene, he makes a very important point there about the approach. He says in 2014, 2015, the banks took a haircut for the customers. The customer didn't even feel it because the government pumped in some money into the banking sector. The question I want to ask you as we wrap up is, what is the best approach to doing this? What would you recommend, knowing what you've said already, that if government attempts this the way it's being suggested, a lot of the banks may possibly go insolvent? What should the best approach be?
Whether we like it, Evans, whether we like it or not, we have come to that point. Then there is a need for us to build up, like Mr. Setekwe said. There needs to be a consensus building, right? To look at this objectively, devoid of politics. If we can get the cream people to meet and look at the impact, do the scenario analysis, because this haircut, we have the holdout, we have the fair cut, fair value, all these things need to be looked at it critically. And I believe that we need a team, people who are passionate about it and who knows what they are talking about, so that we can have something which will not impact. Definitely it will impact on the economy. Whether you like it or not, it's going to impact, especially the domestic debt. It's going to impact on it. And in your discussion, you said that there's the dollar, the euro, the external debt has exceeded. It's not so much it's exceeded. What has happened is that the currency has depreciated over the last period to the extent that it looks like the external debt is over the domestic debt. It's all about currency depreciation. So we need to look at, Mr. Setekwe says something, which I want us, this country, all to be very passionate about this, because we cannot go on the way we are going the way we are going, borrow. I heard him saying that 750 during Mr. Kufuor time was used to pay a single fine. I read this literature by Adams, and I was very surprised that if you borrow to consume, then you're going to have this challenge that we have. It's because it's a country where we don't want to borrow to expand the infrastructure or the system that will build the foreign exchange or bring the currency. But if you borrow to support some payment and what have you, refinancing, at the end of it all, we're going to have a problem. But let me finally say this. In the long term, we need to put a break in the constitution, debt limit. Countries, as you're saying, Kenya has now done it. 50%, you cannot go more than that. Because we keep on going and going and going, and then we come back. I believe the people who look at the constitution, who said the constitution doesn't need to be amended, let me assure them, Germans have it. Even the Americans who borrow over a borrow, they have set a debt cap. Unfortunately for Ghana, this one will borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow. But if you borrow and you don't even put in on strategic investment, that will work to pay itself. I'm sorry. We'll have this argument, this discussion, the next 20 years, the next 40 years, because our infrastructure cannot even support the expansion of the economy. But we keep on saying that we are building the economy. Look, Evans, let me make this simple argument that what they have done earlier, what they are doing now, let the country be very objective and have. I will say that we should get away from the political agenda and have something called the national agenda, where we bring parties together. Mr. Setepe is a brilliant guy. Bring other people together. Let us share opinions. Let us disagree to agree. If we do that, this country will move forward. But the way we are going, everybody wants to bring his friends or his countrymen. But I'm saying that you cannot build a country, a third world country. I won't call it, you're calling it a low income, middle income. Where is the middle income coming from? Where is the middle income coming from? It's coming from poverty has stricken over and over. But we keep on looking semantics, English language. We go here, we dump here. Let us focus on the economy and seriously look at it, how our competencies are, and develop it. If you borrow and put to expand the base of agri, the agri is only 17% of the GDP. And consistently from Mr. Setepe's time, when it was 24, today is about 17%. How can you have a country which is basically agri-based economy? Then we're looking at bringing in vehicles, bringing assembling vehicles here and there. When we cannot support where God has given us the gift, gift, when I say that, we have everything. I drove from Kumasi last night. And if you see the plantain harvest on the road, and I begin to ask me.
I mean, and that goes, what you say goes to changing the fundamental structure of this economy, which is something we've said for decades and decades and never managed to implement. I'm grateful. I'm really grateful, Dr. Chiahane. I'm grateful, Setepe. I mean, look, this conversation, we'll have it again. Definitely, because the real deal, the showdown talks have just begun tonight with the IMF. We'll hear a lot from what is happening, and then we'll help you appreciate it all. I mean, when this is finalized, thankfully, the IMF is very transparent. They'll issue a statement. They said they will publish the debt sustainability analysis. When they do, we'll return here, break it down for you, stress its impact on you. Enjoy the rest of the evening.